We're interviewing at Hamilton College for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive. I'm very pleased to have Pug Horton here on campus, here for a great weekend. Their husband, Bob Wilber, receiving an honorary degree.
An honorary doctorate?
Yes, honorary doctorate in Dr. Wilber. Will be
yeah, don't call him any doc.
No, no doc. That's not quite complete. You've seen the music business from a number of sides as a performer yourself, and now as a managing and getting into the logistics of moving around the world in music. Was there a time in your youth when you said, you know, I really want to be in music? At what point did you think that that might be a possibility?
You know, I don't think I ever planned my life to begin with. I wish I could say that I had made big plans. But what happened to me was I was a kid growing up in the north of England, and of course jazz is not indigenous to the north of England. And I heard a recording of Bessie Smith. And all I can say, Monk, is that I didn't understand. If you remember on that Backwater Blues, and she sings, "When it rains 5 days and the sky turns black as night." I didn't even know, really, what she said. When it rains 5 days and the sky turns black as night. I'd never heard anything like it. It was like a riveting sound. And I knew that I wanted to do something that would bring me closer to learning more about what was going on there. I knew there was something very special happening. And then I listened to Jelly Roll Morton's original Jelly Roll Blues, and I got hooked on jazz. But I never really saw myself as being a part of it. I mean, I just went with the flow, and I did everything that came along, you know? Yeah. And if it required sort of singing a song for some show or something, that's what I would do, or I'd dance. And sort of to sing some chorus on a ice cream or something like that, you know, was kind of fun. And I became a devotee of jazz music, which was rather interesting because there were very few devotees of jazz music in north of England.
You anticipated my next question. Were you kind of a club of one there?
No, as a matter of fact, we had a rhythm club, and I was 11 years old at the time. And I can remember asking someone just quite recently when Bobby and I were up in the north of England, I said, "Tell me, what was I like when I was 11? And this woman said, "You were a cheeky little monkey." I wanted to know everything. You know, for instance, we were very square as jazz fans, and we liked the older type music. We liked King Oliver, and we liked Jelly Roll Morton, and I didn't subscribe to the idea of anyone needing music. I thought real jazz, you didn't need music. So that has been a battle royal between Bobby and me all these years. I didn't see the sense in that, and it was all too glib or too clever. I wanted to have that wonderful ensemble playing that you had in the King Oliver band with all these horns all playing away, and that wonderful spirit, but not having to have it strained, but the purity of it by sort of having to learn too much about it. I equated that, you know. And so we had rather an active rhythm club, but it was very square. I don't think we branched out beyond 1929. I think probably Weatherbird was probably as late as we went when that recording was.
Were records harder to get in the north of England
Oh,
at that time?
interestingly enough, there's a guitar banjo player called Diz Disley in England, and he worked with Stefan Grappelli, and he's a great Django devotee. And I remember he had sent for some records from the United States. And one record in particular was Bunk Johnson, the Tishomingo Blues. And we wanted a record player to play this record on. And we still used rose needles, rose thorns at the time, you know. You used a rose thorn for the record.
Oh,
Did you know that?
I hadn't heard about that.
Oh, my dear, I can tell you stories. In any case, I remember walking at least, and we discussed this recently, Diz and I, at least 5 or 6 miles on a cold winter's day with a trombone player who had terrible asthma, I remember, and he played sort of the Kid Ory type tailgate trombone between breaths of his asthma, or pants, I should say. And we walked miles to go to a house where they had a record player, and we could listen to this, and I've never forgotten, never ever forgotten. So we were enormously enthusiastic, but totally locked into this brief period of jazz, you know.
Was the fact that you had to go through that walking, and it was hard to get the records, did it make the music that much more valuable to you, do you think?
Oh, yes, I think it did, and I think because it was not so available, it was a mission. It was a mission. I mean, you felt that you truly achieved something when you had gotten to that point. My God, it was as great as you knew it was going to be. I can remember listening to that chorus over and over and over again. I mean, it still sits with me, the Tishomingo Blues, and I mean, I want to cry. I'm taken back to when I was 11 years old. Lo, there was many 50-odd years, whatever. Yes.
Who was the next vocalist to affect you like Bessie Smith did?
Nobody ever really affected me like Bessie, but I was cognizant of other singers, and one was Ethel Waters, of course. I admired enormously Ethel Waters because she had great diction. If you'll understand that I couldn't understand what Ma Rainey was saying, and I had trouble with Bessie. I found that with Ethel Waters, she had beautiful diction. And then, of course, Eva Taylor. I loved Eva Taylor's singing because Eva had a great sort of clarity to her voice. So I was impressed by these singers. I didn't turn on to Billie Holiday until much, much later in life.
Was there a language, not a barrier, but some of the things that Bessie Smith may have sung, even if you understood what she was saying, that there was a new phrase in there that maybe wasn't common to English?
Yeah, we were not hip to a lot of these things, and certainly even today. John Hammond was very kind to me, and he gave me quite a lot of music of Bessie's. And I was pleased to see in some of the written words, that the words that I had been singing, lyrics I'd been singing, that everybody had sort of who'd been singing, you know, a lot of the singers who sing the Bessie Smith material had been singing incorrect words. Just sort of you made them up, it was an educated guess. But there are certainly words that were indigenous, not to the north of England, and I felt a bit corny, a bit of a fake, singing them because I didn't have any frame of reference for singing that, and I didn't know about my man Don Gone Left Me and so on, and you know, and I didn't know about the aching head because I was too young to have had an aching head. But I knew she was saying something that was reaching me, and it was an unusual voice. And Bessie had great purity in her voice, you know. I'm not talking about the last record she made. I'm talking about the first record she made with the Bessemer Singers, and she had almost a holy voice, but she was not a gospel singer. I want to make that point right up front. Today's singers that want to sing like Bessie always introduce gospel. Bessie was not. She didn't have any gospel in her voice at all. I'm adamant about that.
I think it's so great that, you know, Bessie Smith lands in the north of England and falls on someone's ears like that. I just love that story.
Well, I think it's unusual. I mean, my father said, she's jazz crazy, you know. And I can remember going to someone's home, and she bought some records. She had a brother in the RAF or something like that, and invited me to go around. And I remember going into the house, and the girl's father was sitting there having his tea, which is like dinner for us, you know, for the working men. And he was sitting there sort of digging into his tea, and this girl put on the record, the phonograph, you know, wound it up, and I started doing this kind of thing. I mean, and this man's looking at me like I had descended from another planet, you know. I mean, again, they didn't understand, because jazz music was really a very esoteric type of sound. We've had good bands, incidentally, in England. I mean, don't forget the Coleman Hawkins and the, you know, the Ramblers, the Dutch Ramblers and stuff, the bands of the big bands of the 30s, Henry Hall, Ambrose, Roy Fox, Jack Hilton, and so on, had some very good bands, and they had good support from the American musicians that chose to come over there, you know, Coleman Hawkins and Benny Carter.
Do you recall what kind of music your parents listened to?
Oh, yes. My father's favorite songs, one of the songs he sang was that when the music goes round and round, it comes out here. My mother liked possibly the songs of Gracie Fields and the sort of the songs that were on the radio. It was mostly the popular music of the 30s, Noel Coward and so on. Interestingly enough, Bobby and I listened to a lot of Gracie Fields. When Bob was asked about his favorite singers, he said, you know, not in jazz. One was Janet Baker, the great English, I suppose you'd call her an opera singer, and the other is Gracie Fields. And Gracie Fields didn't have any musical training, but has an incredible voice. And so that's the kind of music that I was raised on, and that's what my parents listened to.
So when was did you need to search out other musicians a few years later so that you could start to sing?
No, because suddenly, don't forget, this was getting into the late 40s, and we were, just after the war, and we were starting to have these bands sprouting up, all having listened to records, and not always the best records, because we had this Rose Thorn, don't forget, that took a lot away from the fidelity. And so everybody was mad to play like all of these bands that they had heard. So there was a lot of opportunity to sing around with mostly university students who subsequently either went on to become doctors, lawyers, or indeed some of them, like Monty Sunshine or Chris Barber, Ken Collier, did form bands and did become quite successful, and very successful, in the jazz business in England.
Oh. Do you recall some of the first tunes that you sang with these bands?
Well, of course, I sang Ice Cream. I sang Baby Doll, which is very sophisticated, Bessie Smith's Baby Doll, Young Woman Blues, Careless Love Blues, Alexander's Ragtime Band with the verse, because I thought that was so marvelous. I think there was a mistake on the original recording, and they never cleared it up, and I always thought that was fascinating. And then I sang a lot of things that really didn't seem related to jazz, but I felt that there was a possibility of making them in the idiom, which I still do with Bob. I take a song that I've heard that you can make it sound like, you know, that Bessie could have sung it if she'd have known. I mean, for instance, Bud Freeman once told us that he heard Bessie singing I'll See You in My Dreams. And apparently, you think about this, see ya in my dreams, you know, it would have worked. And apparently, according to Chris Albertson, who wrote the book, the definitive book on Bessie, that she sang Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. And I don't doubt it, because, you know, people were required to sing all kinds of material. So.
Well, that gives a whole different spin to the lyrics of I'll See You in My Dreams, to sing them like that, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Great.
But I think that you can, if you think about all the great songs, that there's a way of hearing them and thinking. You know, Bob has always said, if Benny didn't play this, he should have done it.
Oh.
You know?
Yeah. What circumstances brought you to the United States?
First of all, I came to live in Canada in the 50s. I suppose in a way you could say that I was importing husbands, but I'm not really. I came over with my first husband, who was an actor, and we went to live in Canada. and I was working for CBC. I was very active. I was doing a weekly television show, and not singing. I was acting. I was performing, and acting as a showgirl, and one thing or the other. Then I went back to England after doing quite a lot of work. I played a small part in a Frank Sinatra movie, and I did a lot of things living in Florida. And then I went back to England, and couldn't seem to settle there. And I married an Englishman who'd been a resident in medicine in Albany, New York, and we came back over here. And he was a trombone player, played with a jazz band, and we had a very good jazz band in Albany, New York for a long time, and I sang with that, and 12 and a half years, we had a band very actively playing around and played a lot of material, and I did a number of festivals. And then we broke up, and Bobby and I went off together.
Yeah.
And we've been together 21 years now,
That's great.
which is a long time.
Yeah.
Although I wish I had it all to do again. I had to have 21 more. But in any case, it's...
Were you aware of Bob Wilber's music
Oh, yes.
before you met?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I can remember being in my grandmother's kitchen. My grandmother lived in a working class type of cottage, and she had one small mirror, and it was sort of what men used for the shaving. They would shave over the kitchen sink, you see, like this. And I remember putting on this green headscarf. It was very popular in those days to wear a headscarf, and you sort of made it look very chic and so on. And I can remember looking at myself in the mirror, and then my eye catching an article from the Melody Maker, which was the jazz, well, it was mostly jazz in those days. It's not anymore, sadly. And there was an article, and it said, Sidney Bechet takes on young student from Scarsdale. And I thought to myself, that's who I want. And I was 15.
Get out.
No, I was 15 years old. And I can remember looking at myself in the mirror and thinking, oh yes, you look kind of cute, this thing. And looking at this photograph, that's what I want. That's the first time when I said, I'm not being contrary, but when I said I didn't plan my life, that's when I said something that I wanted. And I wrote to Bob. I wrote to the Commodore Music Shop and said, I know you know everybody, could you get me some autographs and photographs? And Bob apparently said he didn't get the letter, but whether he did or not, he subsequently said that he did. But I was fascinated by him, always fascinated by him, always. And although we had a number of meetings, he would come to our summer house in Saratoga when I was married to my former husband, and we would see each other as friends with no thought at all of any escapade. We just loved to talk about jazz, It was like a dream come true. I mean, to be with somebody that you felt you already knew so well, and I admired him. I admired this young man who could have gone any route, and he denied his parents their ambition for him to go off and be a jazz musician, I didn't realize that jazz musicians had 3 or 4 square meals a day and slept in lovely beds with nice clean sheets and everything. I thought it was all like Really the Blues. I mean, when I read Really the Blues, I read it surreptitiously, like you'd read Henry Miller, Sort of, with sort of hoping that no one was going to see what you were reading.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought it was that naughty.
Sometimes it is, but not always.
No, but I was thinking that it was always that all jazz musicians were the way that they would, portrayed by Mesro, and it's not so.
Right. You seem to make a good pair, and I know over the 20 years you've had quite a significant hand in Bob's career. Did you, when you first got into trying to further his career, was it a steep learning process for you of how to negotiate contracts and how to open avenues, how to get him in other parts of the world that he hadn't been in before?
No, because tenacity is my middle name. And I felt, when I got to know Bob better, that I thought that he was far more, he was deserving of far more than he'd actually achieved. When he was young, he had a lot of acclaim with the Wildcats and with the bands he had. And I think he went into a sort of a period of what I thought was something semi-obscurity, which I thought was unfair. And I felt that we had to dig really fast in order to make up for lost time. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I took on a lot of chores that I didn't expect to take on, but because I felt that he was worth it, and I thought the world should know how worth it he was. That's my role in life, I think. I mean, I can sing. I can get up and sing. Bob always laughs, and he says, she doesn't need to rehearse, you know. I mean, I'll tackle Lush Life or anything you want me to sing, but I'm much more interested in being a husband builder. And my husband, I think, is really worth it. Mm-hmm. And so I found that everything came to me. I wrote 4 grants for him to the NEA and got them for him, because I felt that he certainly is passing on a legacy, just as one was passed on to him. I think that Hamilton, in bestowing this honorary doctorate on him, have done a very wise thing. I know they'll never regret it. Uh-huh. And so for me, life has always been, you know, hurdles. I love them. I think that it's just something to do. I mean, you know, you don't just look at it and say, well, what should we do? You get on with it. And I think that's part of my North Country upbringing. I think Marion McPartland, I mean, I know you endowed her with an honorary doctorate. Marion is from the same kind of stock, you know. You don't just stand there. I mean, we English have had to stand up to a lot. And so Bob was a challenge, and Bob's career was a challenge to me. I didn't know how to deal with all these things, but you learn. Mm-hmm. We all have the tools, you know.
Yeah, well said. Did you run into various degrees of honesty and dishonesty in agents and booking him different places?
I ran into a lot of animosity, I should say that, because people are jealous and deeply threatened, and particularly because Bob is a Piscean and he's a very gentle man, and people couldn't understand why he was suddenly getting so taciturn and hard-nosed, you know. And a lot of the time it was his idea, but it was me that was probably blamed. As far as that was concerned, I suppose it made us closer together, which was wonderful. As far as agents are concerned, I think that agents are in a very untenable position. I think they have to be dishonest, even though it's not their nature, because if they were to tell you that they don't have any work, you'd go somewhere else. You parallel it to a builder that comes to your house. If he gives you a price that it's really going to cost, you're going to say, I'm sorry, I can't afford it, and you'll send him on his way. If he tells you it's going to cost less and tells you little fibs or big fibs, you will give him the job, and then he can't do it, and so on and so forth. It's an untenable situation, Monk, and it's one that happens all the time. I don't put it down to dishonesty. I put it down to the fact that it's an overcrowded profession, not necessarily overcrowded with talented people. I think there's a lot of untalented people who are getting work, but that's another issue. That's not what I'm interested in. The fact is, there's only so much work. And for agents, they can only provide you with so many gigs. So they might just string you along, not because they're being devious, but because they are having to sort of say everything nice to everybody.
Yeah. We had an earlier conversation about the importance placed on jazz in this country and abroad. Does it make a difference when you go overseas to play in the response?
Yes, it does. Less than it used to. Because I think that now it's become commonplace. American musicians are appearing on the doorstep just about every other day. And it's been known for certain musicians from the United States to appear twice in our little country in England. And, you know, they're not necessarily filling halls, they're working in small pubs and places like that, that it is beneath them, beneath their talent. And I don't approve of them having to do that. But unfortunately, it's the only way. If you want to do 2 tours a year, you can't do them both in concert halls, you see? I think that now the message has gotten out, and certainly some of the Swedish musicians are brilliant players. Bob's student, Antti Sapila from Finland, has a band that's playing all the time. Antti is a phenomenally talented musician. I think that it's taking the edge off the American standard of playing. First of all, you have to realize the attrition rate among the legends, in quote, legends of jazz, has been very hard on us all, you know, and we've lost so many fine players. And there hasn't been a continuum. The musicians have not been sort of growing up and following in their footsteps and staying with it, as Bob has, for instance, and a number of other people who've been enamored of the music. So there has been a dearth of players to fill those shoes, so that, you know, now you can go to England and the musicians are picking up with a pianist and a rhythm section, so they don't have to take over a rhythm section and so on. I think that there's a great love of the music. That's different in other countries, and I think that people are always willing to pay the dues to the United States for having created, been has spawned this music. And I think they're delighted that young Johnny is playing along with the jazz records and will no doubt join the school jazz band, however it sounds, you know. And there are jazz programs starting throughout the United Kingdom, probably in the same way that there are in this country.
Certainly.
In Switzerland, for instance, there's a great tradition of jazz. For instance, when Hans Zerbrugg, who is a dear friend and a promoter of jazz, has a jazz festival in May in Bern, you play one day at the Raskala, where there are people bringing their babies, and these people were brought there by their parents. Now that is exciting. Because their parents are familiar with all the musicians they're going to see play it, and their children are familiar with it. That's wonderful.
You've got some continuity there.
Yes.
It's really established.
Yes, absolutely. And the same thing applies when, you know, in other places in England, for instance, when people have some frame of reference for what they have seen and they continue to watch and so on. But I think the economics of bringing over musicians is getting harder, and one of the problems that we have, Bobby, I subscribe to as well, is that Bob doesn't like jam sessions. He really likes a formed group because, as you notice from our recordings, we like musicians that have at least shook hands before they go on the stage. They should at least have practiced a couple of things together. Right. And it gets harder because these musicians are being asked, would you like to come over and do 2 weeks in England or Germany or somewhere, and you arrive at the airport and you're picked up by the promoter and you meet all the musicians, and this is Fred and this is Jack and this is, you know, and so on, and you make whatever music you can make. Well, that's fine. That's fine if you're Jelly Roll Morton or if you're King Oliver or Louis Armstrong or Sidney Bechet, but not everybody is, sad to say.
Do you think it sells the music short?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. I think that they don't, people think if that's all there is, maybe that is one of the problems that we have today. I mean, at least the way that it sounded with the rose thorn wasn't great. But at least we were listening to the right stuff. If you're hearing something that's been so, you know, adulterated, down, you know, sort of, it's not going to sound as good. And how can you sound? I think you, as Bob always says, I quote Bob a lot, but he said, you're only as good as the people you play with. And if you're picking up somebody that's just done a 10-hour shift down the mine, as diligent and as enthusiastic as he may well be, he's not going to have the same kind of energy to put on a concert and be in sync with you. Do you think?
I doubt it. I think of that kind of situation even at the jazz parties that exist in this country, where all the musicians certainly are of high caliber, but I would prefer at times to hear some
organized band.
Yeah.
Well, just this past, Matt Domber at his March of Jazz we had a number of sets. We had some wonderful sets. We had sets with Dave McKenna and Dick Hyman and Auntie Sopola, and we had wonderful people. But there's one thing that I cannot, speak highly enough of Bob, but he is an organized person. He's organized in his personal life, and he's organized in his musical life. It's one and the same. Mm-hmm. And before you go on stage, there's never a matter of sort of, what should we play next? Undecided, no, I don't want to sing. Well, we can't, I don't do it in that key. It's never like that.
Right.
We all know what we're going to do. There's always a time when Bob probably fumbles trying to get the program out of his pocket, and
that's the extent of that.
Yeah, and we laugh a little bit about that, but we know where we're going and what we're going to do, and we like to think of music as being theatre. When Bob was director of the Smithsonian, we put on a theatrical performance. It began with me singing a cappella backwater blues, and then went into Mournful Serenade. On a darkened stage, Bob would walk out onto a darkened stage and talk about what is jazz, and then would build. And we would do, in an hour and a half, a whole history of jazz, starting with Bessie Smith and Eva Taylor, and we'd start the second half with Duke Ellington, and I would do the Ivy Anderson. That's what I did with Bob. Our first gig together was at Carnegie Hall, and he asked me to do the music of Ivy Anderson. I said she wasn't really somebody that I had listened to a great deal, and I thought, thank you very much. It was nice of him to ask, but I wouldn't bother. But I digress on that. I did tell him that I didn't want to do it, but he persuaded me that I should. But in any case, we would go on to Thelonious Monk, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and I would sing the something attributed to Sarah Vaughan in her younger days, and close up with I think Count Basie's Jumping at the Woodside, and it was a whole history of jazz. But we presented it as theatre. I would wear clothes that depicted the era with Eva Taylor as Eva would have dressed, and as the stylistic way of Ivy Anderson, who was very elegant, and the way that Sarah Vaughan dressed. I mean, it was all theatre. We mustn't forget that. It's terribly important, Monk, for a performer to realize there is an audience out there, and I love you. I'm performing for you, because when you turn your back on them, you've lost them. Don't even start. I mean, I think it was a man by the name of Morris who wrote In Search of an Audience Development. It was something that particularly interested me for a long time and still does. And I think we only have ourselves to blame if we don't have an audience. We have to be developing an audience all the time that we're performing. All the time. And we must never, ever forget the fact that they came in, bought tickets to see you, so you performed for them. We all perform a service, and that is our service.
Well, the greats certainly knew that. Ellington.
Sure.
And
And you see all those wonderful gestures as the musicians in the brass section, and the way they would throw up their horns, and the guys moving. I mean, it was wonderful, and it was not, playing down to the audience in any way. It was just, there was a sense of joy. I just love it. I love to bring people in. I think it's fantastic, and it's amazing. When we did this performance, we did something, and I acknowledge Connie Haynes and Louise Tobin out in the audience, and I sang a song for them. I sang Billy Strayhorn's Flowers, a Lovesome Thing, and that sells itself. You just stand there and sing the song. But there are other songs when you know that it's essential to bring the people in. It is performing. And I think that a lot of today's younger players, distresses me to say this, that I think they're not cognizant of performing, and they don't have smiles on their faces. I remember Zoot Sims once said to me, "Don't ever, ever, ever sing Rocks in My Bed with a smile on your face." He was right. But I think that there is a way of having passion or having some feeling in your face, not a vacuous stare.
Yeah. Over the years, did you ever run into any racial, I don't know exactly what the word would be.
Reverse prejudice?
Yeah.
I suppose, you know, I've only been blonde for a few years since I started to go gray. Mm-hmm. I used to be very, very dark. In fact, when Gus Johnson met me for the first time, he believed that I was black. And I have a very dark skin, and I don't know whether, I don't think people feel any different regardless of what color they are. I think that there has been times when I've read articles about people, you know, not liking a singer because they were of a different colored persuasion, you know. Mm. But it's never actually happened to me. I don't believe so. I've worked with performers, and I roomed with Maxine Sullivan, and I never felt it, and I don't think anyone ever made me feel conscious of it. The fact that John Hammond, Hank O'Neill once said, "You're the only singer that John Hammond ever said anything nice about, except for the ones that he really loved, you know, Billy and Bessie." Mm. He said to Hank, "Have you heard this girl, Pug Horton?" And Hank said, "No, I haven't." He said, "She's all right," which I thought was a very high compliment. And of course I worked with musicians of all color, yeah. You know. I mean, it didn't bother me, so why would it have bothered them? I mean, my heart was in the right place. Yeah.
Well, there seems to be some controversy going on in the last few years about white musicians' place in jazz today and whether or not they have usurped the music. And I find it curious that there seems to be very few young black musicians playing what we have come to call classic jazz. At the jazz parties, you don't see many.
That is true, but last year when Bob did his tributes to Sidney Bechet and he worked with Wynton Marsalis, all the musicians with Wynton were totally dedicated to what was going on. I think it's because they didn't have an interest in it. It's not that they couldn't do it, and I think maybe now they're becoming more aware of the music. Certainly Michael White loves Johnny Dodds and would love to play like him. I think that there is also a period of what is young people's music. It's not to do with color. It's to do with what kind of music are young people listening to, not color, not black, white, Hispanic, this, Chinese. Mm-hmm. It's what kind of music are young people listening to? And basically, they're not listening to classic jazz. I think that it's part of the era that we're living in. It would be nice if they would accept classic jazz as being part of the history of music, and that should be mandatory. But I blame families, I blame academics for not teaching this. I think there's a lot of teachers have abrogated the role by not going back far enough, maybe because they themselves didn't know enough about it. And perhaps they were not given good schooling on the early music. They were not taught about, you know, the era of ragtime. They were not taught about the early days of jazz. And as a result, you cannot fault the student for not learning. I have believed always that if the student hasn't learned, the teacher has not taught.
Yeah, because we're getting a couple generations away from that music now. So it gets harder and harder. If the generation right after the music didn't get it, what makes you think the next one's going to? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you spoke pretty eloquently earlier on about the fact that every generation has its own thing, has to find its own way. I wish we could find a way that the music could be made available, perhaps more available than it is, so that they could make their own choice.
Well, I think that you're going in the right direction. You're certainly going in the right direction here with people like Milt Villiers and what you're doing, Monk. I think certainly you can encourage, there are a lot of people of Bob's age group who are more than happy to come onto your campus and spend a month doing an artist in residency. Mm-hmm. They are sitting around, not necessarily wanting to be running for gigs all the time, but they would be happy to pass on their legacy and to come in and be articulate and talking. not to be threatening the teachers. They're not looking to take over a full-time job with tenure at a university. But they would be delighted, I think, to come in and talk about what it really is like to be a street musician, not just an academic, not somebody who's graduated with a bachelor's degree and taken the job right away.
Yeah,
all right?
good point.
Now, I think that it is possible. You're looking for an answer, I'm going to give you one, all right? I am not a wishy-washy person. I'm going to tell you that you look around the country, there are people who are articulate musicians who would be happy to give you 2 weeks of their time, you accommodate them, you treat them as well as you have been treating us, and you say, talk to our students, tell them about the relevance of this music. And you bring in somebody else, and you bring in somebody else, and you bring in somebody else. You can get funding for doing these kind of things. And I have to say that more often than not, do you know who's going to be more upset than anybody? I don't know that it's this way here, but I tell you in most of the academic campuses we go, are the teachers. Because what you're doing is almost teaching sedition. You are teaching these students, you're telling these students something that maybe is opening up a Pandora's box, because maybe the teacher is suddenly out on a limb. He doesn't know, maybe, about that period, all right, that you're going to talk about. But people shouldn't be threatened. The whole idea of being in teaching is not to be threatened, but to give of your own ability and learn. Keep your own ears open. And to have these kids being given every opportunity. Now, I know, for instance, that in Arizona, that there are 2 very good academic programs in music. My husband has not been asked to do anything, even though he'd be happy to go up there and give his time, just to sort of make sure that the legacy is passed on. Why don't they want him? What if he goes in there and tells the real story of what jazz is about? Not some you know, far-reaching fantasy. Or what if he just goes in there and just says, look, I'm Bob Wilber, and this is what I've done all my life. And there are many other people like him who would be delighted to do this. Wouldn't that be a good idea? Wouldn't that be one way of salvaging what is left and hoping that you're going to give jazz music the credibility that it should have? The place in American society is to start with young people. And when young people hear Bob talk and hear these legends talk, they have a whole excitement about what they're learning. I don't know what to say.
We said it pretty well. We really did. I think sometimes academics may be threatened by people who have made their living playing the music instead of just teaching about it. You know, that may be a threat to them. But there are some inroads being made in that.
I'd like to think so.
Yeah.
And there are certainly teachers. I mean, there's one particular teacher at the University of New Hampshire who is very encouraging and is always getting people like Clark Terry and Bob to go up there and bring his charts and to work with them. And I think that this is one thing that you can do. You can certainly set aside some time. And I think another problem that is part of our society, Monk, is that students are being called upon to give far too many hours for other extracurricular things, that their time is so valuable. I know when Bob is doing other academic programs, he would say, did you listen to the music? Did you play the music? I said, we haven't had time, we had to do so-and-so, we had to do something else, and so on. So I do think that our young people today are being challenged in many ways, and they're having to prioritize. And this is not necessarily something that they're going to go in for. Maybe they're not going to be full-time professional jazz musicians, but they could be full-time professional musicians or teachers.
And they could be a great audience, too.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
We certainly need that.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, this has really been fascinating. What's in the near future for you guys?
Well, we leave for England on June the 1st. We go to Silkeborg in Denmark for a wonderful festival, which is, now here's the thing, sponsored by Tuborg Beer. which money is no object, which is lovely, so it shows you where their values are. But nonetheless, we've been going for 3 years now. We are going to be there with the Bessie legacy, as I say, with Phil Flanagan and Eddie Metz, Mark Shane, Dave Cliff, a wonderful guitarist from England that we've used a lot, and Eric John Kelso, trumpet player. And then in July, Bob is doing a mini tour with Kenny DeVerne, and we're going to hang out in Juan-le-Pin just to soak up the air, as you would say, and just enjoy it. And August, we will be in France at festivals and in Toulouse. And then in September, we've decided to go into France and look for a place that we thought we'd like to have a little place on the ocean in Normandy. So we're going to go and explore, and then we go to Japan with the Statesman of Jazz, which is the one where Bob is the baby and the oldest member is 96. And then we do a big band cruise in November. And so it brings us to the end of 1998 and the year of semi-retirement.
That's what I was about to say. My God.
But I have to tell you that, I mean, not that Bob wants to hurt anyone's feelings, but he turns down probably more work than many people are offered because he wants to do the kind of things that he wants to do, and he's doing it.
Yeah.
And we're both doing it, and we're enjoying enormously. We have a very active life with our children, our grandchildren, and so on. And next year looks like, with the exception of April, when we will be in Paradise Valley and doing concerts in Denver and in Atlanta, I think that we have no work, which is wonderful, just the month of April. And it pleases us because it gives us more time just to enjoy picking the grapefruit.
And listening to some of your favorite singers.
I have very little time to do, but I have to say that when I do, there are things that absolutely still knock me out.
Yeah.
Things, the old things that I've heard over and over and over and over again. I still am totally moved to tears by a lot of the things that I've been listening to for all these years.
Yeah.
So.
I guess that's why they call it classic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, it's been great talking to you, and I'm so glad you're on campus here for the weekend.
Well, we're so delighted.
And enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Thank you.
And I hope we run into each other again soon.
I hope so.
Hopefully on a cruise.
Wouldn't that be nice? Yes. Thank you, Monk.
Okay.
It was lovely talking
Thanks so much.
to you. Thank you.
Then one morning I woke up to find money, jewelry, lovers had gone. How did it happen? Why did it have to end? I had it, but it's all gone now. Somehow I had it, but it's all gone now.